Hello and welcome to the latest installment of HFW Industry Insights, where we speak to leading figures across the core sectors of HFW about the key issues facing their business and the wider market. Our guest today is the CEO of energy consulting and advisory firm Qamar Energy. Robin is an expert on energy strategy and economics, described by Foreign Policy magazine as, quote, one of the world's great energy minds. Robin established Qamar in 2015 to advise governments, utility companies, and other industry players on energy policy and strategy. He has previously worked with several leading energy companies, including Shell, the Emirates National Oil Company, and has led major consulting assignments for the EU in Iraq. Robin, a warm welcome to you. Robin, tell us a bit more about Qamar and the work that you do with clients across the energy sector.
Thank you, and thank you to everybody for listening. Glad to be here. So, as you've said, I founded Qamar 10 years ago now. This year is indeed our 10th anniversary. And I've been based in the Middle East now for 20 years, and I always saw the Middle East, of course, as the heart of the global energy industry. And that's why I saw the opportunity for a regionally based energy consultancy, one that can bring the best of international expertise and knowledge, but also the local understanding of the region. And the Middle East is a complex region, a very diverse region. It's definitely not monolithic at all. The conditions, seen from the outside, are very different as opposed to when you're actually on the ground. And it's also a very fast-changing region because of its own internal dynamics, but also because of the changing dynamics of the energy industry, which I'm sure we'll explore today. And those are really key issues: how to help regional governments, companies, entities who are involved in energy, who have an interest in energy and exposure to energy, which is almost everybody in the Middle East in some way, how to help them navigate a very complex energy transition, which looks very different here from what it would look like in North America or in Europe or elsewhere in the world.
So let's explore that a bit. So you've been working in the region for about 2 decades. What do you see as some of the key changes in the Middle East energy landscape over that time?
So I arrived in the Middle East to live and work here in the start of 2006. I'd worked on the Middle East a lot before that. I knew the region already very well. But what struck me when I arrived was very little talk about the environment, about climate change, about issues of energy transition, but quite soon, actually, in that period, those issues came up the agenda remarkably quickly and became top issues, and they remain so today, or even more so. So that has been a dramatic change, and that is to do with I think two parallel developments. One is the realization that the energy transition is happening, and that there's a need for the Middle East to adapt to that. Obviously, it's still the world's premier hydrocarbon region, and will, I think, remain so for decades to come, and that will remain a core part of the economy. But the recognition that the region needed to take climate change seriously, needed to think about it, how it would adapt to the challenge of climate change, both the effects on the Middle East itself and on its energy industry. So that was kind of one track, and the other track was really the realization of the very great opportunities that it brings with new technologies, and the development and the improvement of new technologies in the energy industry. And that includes, obviously, things like solar power, which has absolutely taken off here in a huge way, but also in the traditional energy industry, in the oil and gas industry as well, and trying to make the best of all of those opportunities, while being very aware to the risks and the transformation ahead.
So we know that the big story over recent years has been energy transition away from fossil fuels to renewable energy sources. But you've written a book called The Myth of the Oil Crisis, in which you argue that there is still an important role for oil in the global energy mix. Do you believe that still? And if so, how do energy companies navigate the environmental and geopolitical challenges around oil production?
So The Myth of the Oil Crisis, as you say, I wrote that, and it was published in 2009. And at that point, as you'll recall, the big concern in the energy industry was over peak oil, and the idea that oil supply was about to peak. and we were going to go into a world of scarce oil supplies and very high prices, economic damage, and so on. And my point in that book was, no, this is completely fallacious. There is no shortage of oil or natural gas resources in the world that can be produced and developed at reasonable costs. And there are, of course, technical challenges, political challenges, and so on. But these are all things that can be overcome, and that indeed would be overcome. And this was, in the very early days of the shale revolution in the US. I think we had some idea that was coming, but not to the kind of the pace and the size of it. But indeed that has happened, and I think proved a big part of the thesis of the book right, that oil and gas resources are plentiful. But the book was absolutely also said, well, look, this is a counter to the prophets of doom. The world economy isn't going to run out of oil and collapse. But that kind of makes the other challenge even more pertinent, is the challenge of too much carbon and the danger of an excess of fossil fuels, and therefore of worse and worse emissions and worse and worse climate change. And my point was that the environmental movement needed to engage with that very seriously, and not to raise the idea of peak oil supply as being something that was a reason to get away from oil and gas. But the challenge of actually very abundant oil and gas supply, how to use that in a constructive way, but without wrecking the climate. And then obviously various parts of that solution, and carbon capture and storage being one of the major ones. So the recognition that yes, we will use less oil and gas in future. We will develop alternative energies. We will develop renewables and other technologies as we are doing. But there still will be a long-standing role for oil and gas if it's used in a sensible and responsible way.
So you've touched on carbon capture. Can we develop that just a little bit? What role do you see carbon capture as playing in combating climate change, and is it likely to be effective?
Yeah, carbon capture is a key technology, and it's very much an unloved one, certainly by climate change campaigners, by environmental groups, and so on, because of the ties to the fossil fuel industry, and it's seen as often as a fake solution, something that doesn't work, or a distraction or a diversion by the fossil fuel industry. And I would say the fossil fuel industry has not taken carbon capture and storage as far ahead, nearly as far or as fast as it should have done. Part of that is maybe a risk aversion, is unwillingness to commit fully. Part of it is indeed, unfortunately, the idea to use carbon capture as a bit of a delaying tactic. Part of it is the failure by governments to step up properly and support carbon capture in the same way as they've supported other things like solar power. But it is a very real and very important technology. I think the perspective on it has changed a bit since I wrote my book on carbon capture in 2011. At that point, I think it looked more likely there'd be a lot more carbon capture in the power sector. I think that probably could still happen, but probably less so. The emphasis is now much more on renewables and on batteries in the power sector. But there's a huge remaining role for carbon capture and storage in the industrial sector. And there are many core industrial processes like steel making, take the manufacture of ammonia, take the manufacture of cement, a bunch of core industrial materials. There is no technically and economically feasible way to produce those at scale today in a zero carbon way or a low carbon way without using carbon capture and storage. That's really where the key opportunity is today, I think. And that's when I hear people saying, oh, we don't need carbon capture and storage, we have renewables. And I would say, yeah, can you make cement with renewables? No. So that's where the role is, and that is a very big role for the oil and gas industry too, is actually being a genuine part of the climate solution and delivering carbon capture.
Okay. Challenges, biggest challenge facing the Middle East energy market today, what would you say it is?
Well, the biggest long-term challenge is a simple one. It is the growing competitiveness of low carbon energies, and I mean renewables, solar and wind in particular, twinned with batteries, and electric vehicles as a replacement for oil fuel vehicles, particularly in the ground transport. And the competitiveness of all of those has advanced, literally kind of light years from 20 years ago, when the position of oil and gas was a lot more assured. And yet, the bulk of share of oil and gas in the overall energy demand has shifted only very little since then. And I think that's a bit dangerous for the Middle East. It does kind of invite complacency. If you go back 5 years, there was a lot more confidence. I think that the energy transition was fully upon us, that oil and gas companies needed to become multi-energy companies and move much more into low carbon energies, that peak oil demand was imminent, and that global oil demand would soon peak and start declining. Now I think the zeitgeist has shifted, and there's more of a view that yes, oil and gas will be with us for a longer time. The transition will be slower. That these shifts into renewables have not been commercially successful for companies that tried that. And while there is truth in all of that, I think you have to look at trends and look at the most advanced players in all of these sectors. And you see where the future is already with us. And it is absolutely that these technologies are very real competitors to oil and gas, and in some cases already superior to it. So that long-term picture for me hasn't changed, even if it's delayed by a couple of years. And that is a big challenge for the Middle East, where the regional economy still depends extremely heavily on the export and on the use of oil and gas.
So switching then from challenges, what's the biggest opportunity for the Middle East energy market today?
I believe that, again, there's a twin opportunity there. I mean, the first part of it is to use the existing hydrocarbon resources in as low carbon way as possible, to be the last producer standing, to be the producer that has the lowest costs, the biggest volumes, the lowest carbon footprint out to 2050 and beyond. That has always been a big part of the strategy, and I think that remains very valid. But the second part of that is to add the low carbon technologies and to build on the Middle East's advantages in that. So the Middle East has obviously huge areas of very sunny land, which is quite readily available. It has, in some places, excellent wind resources. It has great geography. It's between Europe and Asia, and has access to sea routes to all the key global markets. It has a very long experience with energy industry, a lot of very strong infrastructure. There's a lot of positives in which the Middle East can become a center of the use of low carbon energy and an exporter of low carbon systems and materials to the rest of the world. For example, green steel, green ammonia, green cement, green aluminium, all these kind of materials made in a low carbon way. And that is a huge opportunity for the region. It's starting to be seized, I would say, but a long way to go. But that is for me is the path for the transition on the energy side for this region.
So finishing with some quick fire questions. What's the secret to doing business in the Middle East in your view?
I think a big part of it is being on the ground and having patience. It is not a region where you fly in and land and shake hands and do a deal and immediately start work. It's a region that benefits from long-term focus, understanding its challenges and building relationships. And as I said at the start, again, not seeing it as a monolith, and the countries are very, very different from each other, and they have each demand their own approaches, have their own challenges. So it's that kind of long-term relationships and patience, and really taking the time to understand the challenges and come with specific bespoke solutions, not generic things taken from elsewhere in the world.
And do you have a proudest moment professionally?
Yes, I could point to a few, but look, I think one of them is in 2012 we pointed to the sudden competitiveness of solar power in the Middle East, and we pointed out that it had now at that point reached the point that it was more economic than using oil for power generation. That seems like a truism today, but in 2012 that was kind of groundbreaking, and that view was very quickly picked up, and we've seen a tremendous boom in solar power through the region since. I wouldn't claim anything like sole credit for that, of course, but I think we played a little part of our role in really kickstarting solar power in the region.
Okay. Robin, you speak 6 languages: English, Dutch, Arabic, Farsi, Norwegian, and French. Which was the hardest to learn, and which is your favorite to speak, and why?
Well, that's really an interesting challenge, yes. The Arabic was for sure the hardest. I mean, as a non-Indo-European language, and a very complex and a very rich one with a great literature of its own. So I would have to say that was certainly the hardest, but also in many ways the most rewarding. As a favorite to speak, they all have their different places in different stages of my life and different parts of my affections. But I like to think I have kind of Viking roots going back, so I'm going to say Norwegian.
Robin, Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.